Hi everyone, my name is Megan Holloway. I'm 34 years old, I live in Columbus, Ohio, and I never, not in a million years, thought I would be sitting here telling the story to strangers on the internet. But here I am, because the truth is, I've been carrying this for almost 2 years now. I've talked to a therapist, I've cried alone in my car more times than I can count. I've had conversations in my head with my brother that I will never actually get to have. And somewhere along the way, someone told me that writing it out or saying it out loud might finally let me put some of it down. So that's what I'm doing. I want to be upfront with you. This story involves my family, a house, a court hearing, and a letter that my dead brother wrote before he passed. And I know that already sounds like a lot, but I promise you, by the time we get to that letter, by the time you hear what Daniel actually wrote, you're going to understand why this broke me open in a way I wasn't expecting. Some of it is painful, some of it is infuriating, and some of it, honestly, is the most profound thing I've ever experienced in my life. So let me start at the beginning. I grew up in a pretty normal-looking family. Mom, dad, 3 kids, my older brother Daniel, me in the middle, and my younger sister Kayla. We grew up in a mid-sized house in a suburb of Columbus, nothing fancy but comfortable. Dad worked in logistics. Mom worked part-time at a dental office. We weren't rich, but we weren't struggling either. On paper, we looked fine. But I think if you grow up in a family with a favorite child situation, you know from a very young age that things are not quite what they look like on paper. And in our family, the favorite was Kayla. I want to be careful here because I know how this sounds. I know every middle child in existence thinks they were the overlooked one, and every youngest child gets accused of being spoiled. I'm not trying to play the victim card just for sympathy points. I'm telling you this as context because it matters deeply. For everything that comes later, Kayla was the baby. She was pretty, she was charming, she was the one who could cry in front of my parents and get anything she wanted within about 4 minutes. And from the time she was maybe 10 or 11 years old, she figured that out about herself. She knew exactly how to work my mother. She knew exactly how to get my father to look the other way. And she used it. Daniel and I used to talk about it when we were teenagers. We'd be up late on weekend nights, sitting in the kitchen, eating cereals, and just talking, the way siblings do when they don't want the night to end. And he'd say things like, "You know, Mom would literally sell one of us to pay for Kayla's prom dress, right?" And we'd laugh, but it was one of those laughs that's only partially funny, because the rest of it was just true. Daniel was the oldest by 4 years. He was 6 when I was born, 10 when Kayla came along. And he had this incredibly steady quality about him, like nothing really rattled him. He was the kind of person who, when something unfair happened, didn't rage about it or spiral. He'd just get quiet, think it through, and decide what he was going to do about it. I envied that about him my entire life. I used to absorb conflict. Daniel processed it. He was also the most quietly brilliant person I've ever known. He wasn't showy about it. He didn't brag. He just figured things out. He bought his first house at 26. He'd saved and invested since he was 19 years old. By the time he was in his early 30s, he owned 2 properties, the house he lived in and a small rental, and had a retirement account that our father, who never saved a dime, genuinely couldn't comprehend. He built that life on his own, with no help from our parents, no loans from family, no safety net, just Daniel doing what Daniel did. And then, when he was 37, he got diagnosed with stage 3 colon cancer. I need to pause here for a second, because if you've ever lost someone, really lost someone, not in the distant way where it's sad but sort of abstract, but lost someone who was a fundamental part of how you understood yourself in the world, then you know what I mean when I say that Daniel's diagnosis didn't just scare me. It rearranged something inside me. He was my person. He was the one who called just to check in, not because something was wrong. He was the one who remembered the things I said months ago and brought them back up in ways that made me feel seen. When I went through my divorce at 30, Daniel was the one who drove 4 hours to sit with me in my apartment and eat takeout and not say very much, but somehow make everything feel survivable. I am not the same without him. That's just the truth. He fought for almost 2 years. He had surgery, chemotherapy, more surgery. He had periods where we genuinely believed that he was going to make it. And then he had periods where you could see in his eyes that he was tired in a way that sleep wasn't going to fix. During those 2 years, I drove to his house every single weekend that I could. I took FMLA leave from my job twice to help him with medical appointments. I managed his insurance paperwork. I called his doctors. I cooked for him when he couldn't stand long enough to cook for himself. I'm not saying this to make myself sound noble. I'm saying it because it's relevant. Because here's what my parents did during those 2 years. They visited maybe once a month, sometimes less. And Kayla, who lived 40 minutes away from Daniel, who had no job at the time, who had a car and a flexible schedule, visited him a grand total of maybe 8 times in 22 months. I counted because I was there. I know who was there and who wasn't. Daniel and I talked about a lot of things during those 2 years. When you're sitting with someone who is genuinely confronting their own mortality, the conversations get very real, very fast. There's no small talk. There's no filtering. You say the things that matter because you understand on a cellular level that the window for saying them is closing. He talked to me about the house. His primary residence, the one he'd lived in for almost 8 years, was a beautiful craftsman-style home in a neighborhood he'd carefully chosen. 3 bedrooms, a big backyard, original hardwood floors. He'd put an enormous amount of work into it. He loved that house. About 14 months before he died, when he was going through a particularly hard stretch of treatment, he said to me, we were sitting on his back porch. It was September, and the light was doing that thing it does in early fall, where everything looks like it's glowing. He said, Meg, when I go, I want you to have this house. I told him not to talk like that. He gave me the look, the Daniel look, the one that meant stop deflecting and hear what I'm actually saying to you. I'm not being morbid, he said. I'm being practical, and I need you to know what I want. You've been here. You've shown up. You deserve something real from me, not just grief. I cried. He didn't. That was very Daniel. We talked about it 2 more times after that. He always came back to the same thing. The house was for me. He said he'd handle it. He said not to worry. I believed him. Because when Daniel said he'd handle something, he handled it. He died on a Tuesday morning in March. I was there. I held his hand. I'm not going to describe that part. Some things aren't meant to be stories. The weeks after Daniel's death were what you'd expect. A fog of arrangements, condolences, casseroles left on doorsteps, a funeral that somehow had to be both enough and could never be enough. My parents were devastated, genuinely. Whatever complicated feelings I had about their choices, they had loved Daniel. His death broke them. Kayla showed up to the funeral in a new dress, and spent most of the reception talking to Daniel's friends she'd never met, laughing at stories about him like she'd been present for them. I noticed. I didn't say anything. It was not the time. About 3 weeks after the funeral, my mother called me and told me that she and my father had been in contact with Daniel's attorney to discuss the estate. She said there were some things to sort out. She sounded careful, measured, which was not how my mother usually sounded on the phone. I asked if I should come to the meeting. She said it was just a preliminary thing, nothing formal, just to understand what Daniel had left behind. I said okay. She called me again 4 days later, and this time her voice was different, lighter somehow. She said that the attorney had shared Daniel's will and that it had some things in it, assets, accounts that were being distributed. She mentioned the rental property was being sold and the proceeds were going to a charity Daniel had specified. And then she said, in the same conversational tone as the rest of it, "The house is going to Kayla. I'm sorry. Let me say that again. The house is going to Kayla." I didn't say anything for a long moment. I think I thought I had misheard her. "What?" I said. "Your father and I talked to the attorney and we decided, for the family, for peace, that it made the most sense for Kayla to have the house. She doesn't have as much stability as you do, Megan. You have your career, your own place. Kayla needs a foundation. I want you to understand something about this moment." My mother was not reading from Daniel's will. She was telling me what she and my father had decided, as if the house was theirs to decide about. "Mom," I said very carefully, "Daniel told me he wanted me to have the house." "Oh, sweetheart." And the way she said it, patronizing, almost pitying, made my stomach drop. Daniel said a lot of things when he was sick. He was emotional. He wasn't always thinking clearly about what was fair. I couldn't speak. I genuinely could not form words. "Kayla needs this more than you do," my mother continued. "You're stable. You'll be fine. This is what we feel is right." And then she moved on to talking about who was getting Daniel's furniture. I want to stop here for a second, because I know some of you are already furious on my behalf. And honestly, that means a lot to me. But I also want to be honest with you about what I did in that moment. I didn't fight, not right then. I got off the phone with my mother, and I sat in my kitchen for about 2 hours, and I cried, and I felt the particular humiliation of being erased from my own brother's legacy by the same people who had always made me feel like the child who needed less. And then I did what I always did in my family. I went quiet. I absorbed it. I told myself that fighting over a house while we were all still grieving was wrong. I told myself maybe my mother was right and I was being selfish. I told myself Daniel would have hated conflict. I minimized it until it felt small enough to carry. And look, if you've ever dealt with a family dynamic where one person is always the favorite and you are always the ones expected to just understand, you already know exactly what I'm talking about. Because this is what those families do to you. They train you over decades to dismiss your own perceptions, to believe that your feelings are the problem, not their behavior. So I went quiet. I let it happen. And then, about 6 weeks later, I got a call from an attorney I didn't recognize. His name was Robert Calloway. He identified himself as a probate and estate attorney in Columbus. He told me he had been Daniel's attorney, not just his attorney for the will that had already been shared with the family, but his personal attorney who had known Daniel for almost 5 years. He said he needed to speak with me in person. I drove to his office on a Wednesday afternoon in May. 2.5 months after Daniel's death. I remember sitting in the parking lot for a few minutes before I went in, just trying to steady myself. I didn't know what I was walking into. I didn't know if this was good news or bad news or some kind of complicated complication I didn't have the energy for. Robert Calloway was a quiet man in his 60s, silver-haired, with the kind of careful manner that serious attorneys tend to develop over decades. He shook my hand, offered me water, and got straight to the point. He told me that Daniel had come to see him approximately 9 weeks before he died. He told me that during that visit, Daniel had requested the preparation of a legal document, a codicil to his existing will, specifically addressing the disposition of his primary residence. He told me that Daniel had signed this codicil in the presence of 2 witnesses and a notary on a specific date that I will never forget for as long as I live. And then he told me that Daniel had also left a sealed letter in his own handwriting with instructions that it was to be read aloud in the presence of all relevant parties at whatever legal proceedings arose around his estate. He placed both documents on the desk in front of me. He said, "Your brother was a very deliberate man, Miss Holloway." I could barely breathe. The codicil was 3 pages. Legal language, formal structure, very clear. It named me, Megan Claire Holloway, as the sole beneficiary of the property at the address I knew as Daniel's home. It specified that this disposition superseded any previous verbal or written representations. It included language that explicitly addressed attempts to redirect the property by surviving family members acting outside legal authority. Daniel's attorney had drafted it to be airtight. My brother had gone to a lawyer while he was sick, while he was exhausted, while he was managing chemotherapy and pain and the daily work of just staying alive. And he had made absolutely certain that I would be protected because he knew exactly what would happen. And I sat in that attorney's office and I felt the love in that act so completely, so overwhelmingly, that I had to press my hand against my mouth to hold in the sound I wanted to make. The letter. I'm going to tell you about the letter. This is the part I've thought about the most. The part that changed me. Because of the legal proceedings that followed, which I'll get to, the letter was read aloud in court. It became part of the official record, and so I have a copy. I've read it many times. I know it almost by heart now. But in that attorney's office in May, I read it for the first time alone. It was 6 pages. Handwritten. Daniel's handwriting, which I would know anywhere, the slightly left-leaning print he'd had since middle school. He started it, Megan. If you're reading this, then some version of what I was afraid of has happened. I want you to know that I'm not surprised, and I want you to know that you should not, for even 1 single second, feel guilty about what comes next. I put the letter down. I stared at the ceiling. I breathed. Then I kept reading. He talked about our parents. He wrote about them with love, genuine love, but also with a clarity that was almost clinical. He wrote, "Mom and Dad love us, but they have never been able to see you clearly. They see Kayla as fragile and you as strong, and they have made that into a reason to give her everything and ask you to accept it graciously. I know this because I watched it my entire life. I watched you accept it. It made me so angry, Meg, not at you, at them, for teaching you to disappear." I had to stop reading again. When I got back to it, he talked about Kayla. He didn't write about her with cruelty, but he was honest. He wrote, "Kayla is not a villain. She's someone who was handed a version of reality where she is always the most important person in the room, and she believed it, because why wouldn't she? But that doesn't mean she gets what isn't hers. The house was always yours. You earned it by showing up. I don't mean financially. I mean in every way that actually matters. And then, toward the end, he wrote the part that has lived in me ever since. He wrote, "I want you to know what you gave me. You showed up every weekend when you didn't have to. You managed my insurance paperwork when it would have been easier to hire someone. You sat with me on the porch and let the silence be comfortable because you understood that sometimes I didn't have any more words and I didn't need you to fill it. You treated me like a person who still had dignity, not like a project, not like a tragedy. You were just there. That was everything. That was the whole thing, Meg. And the house is just me trying to leave you something that says, I saw you. I see you. You matter more than they let you believe you do. I cannot tell you what it is to be seen by someone who is gone. I cannot tell you what it is to hold 6 handwritten pages and understand that while you were sitting with someone through their dying, they were sitting with you too, quietly, in their own way, making sure you'd be okay. I cannot tell you because I don't have words for it yet. What I can tell you is what happened next. My parents and Kayla had, in the time between Daniel's funeral and my meeting with Robert Calloway, already begun the paperwork to transfer the house into Kayla's name. They had moved quickly. My parents had some limited executor authority under the initial will they'd been shown, and they had interpreted that authority very broadly. They had started the process without consulting me, without consulting Robert Calloway, and without disclosing the fact that a separate meeting with Daniel's personal attorney was pending. Robert Calloway had been attempting to contact them for weeks. They had not returned his calls. When he filed the codicil with the probate court and initiated proceedings, the response from my family was not, as I had naively hoped, quiet acceptance. My mother called me screaming. And I do mean screaming. I'm talking about a level of volume and fury that I had not heard from her since I was 16 years old, and I'd come home 2 hours past curfew. She told me I had gone behind the family's back. She told me that I had betrayed Daniel's memory by dragging him into court. She told me that Kayla was devastated, that I was doing this to Kayla, specifically out of jealousy. She said the word jealousy. She said I had always been jealous of my sister, and this was just the latest example. I held the phone and I listened. I let her finish. And then I said very calmly, Mom, I didn't do anything. Daniel did this. He prepared this document 9 weeks before he died. He did this on purpose. So if you're angry at someone, you need to think carefully about who that is. She hung up on me. My father called the next day. He was quieter, but no less angry. He used phrases like family unity and what Daniel would have wanted, and this isn't about money, it's about respect. He told me that by pursuing this legally, I was causing irreparable damage to our family. I asked him one question. I said, Dad, did Daniel ever tell you he wanted me to have the house? Long pause. He may have said something like that, my father said, but he wasn't well. He was a 40-year-old man with a law degree's worth of legal documents sitting in a notarized file, I said. He was not confused. He knew exactly what he was doing. My father didn't say anything. I love you, I said. But I'm not backing down from this. Kayla did not call me herself for almost 2 weeks. When she finally did, the conversation was unlike anything we had ever had. She didn't yell. She didn't cry. She was if I'm being honest, shockingly composed, and that composure scared me more than the yelling had. She said she understood that I felt entitled to the house. She said she respected that Daniel and I had been close. She said she hoped I knew that she had loved him too. And then she said, "But I need you to understand that my situation is different from yours. I don't have what you have. I've been struggling. This house would have genuinely changed my life. And I feel like you're taking it from me even though you don't actually need it." I thought about Daniel's letter, the part where he wrote about Kayla being handed a version of reality, where she is always the most important person in the room. I said, "Kayla, this wasn't mine to give or take. It was Daniel's to decide, and he decided. Because you manipulated him," she said, still calm, still measured. "You were there all the time. You made him feel guilty. You made him feel like he owed you." And there it was. I had been waiting for that. Because in my family, when you receive something good, there is always a version of the story where you manipulated or tricked or guilted your way into it. The good things can never just be yours. There is always an asterisk. "I'm not having this conversation," I said, and I hung up. The probate hearing was scheduled for late July. In the weeks leading up to it, I was a mess. I know I keep saying I'm not presenting myself as perfect, and I mean it. I was struggling. I was grieving Daniel. I was in conflict with my entire family. I was second-guessing myself constantly. Some nights I lay awake thinking, what if I'm wrong? What if I am the selfish one? What if Daniel would have been appalled by all of this? And then I'd remember 6 pages of handwriting, and I'd breathe. My attorney, Robert Calloway, who agreed to represent me as well, told me the case was straightforward. The codicil was properly executed, properly witnessed, properly notarized. It was legally sound. My parents' interpretation of their executor authority had been a significant overreach. The probate judge would see that. What he could not predict was the letter. Because the letter, technically, was not a legal document. It was personal correspondence. But Daniel had instructed Robert explicitly that it was to be read in open court as part of the hearing if any dispute arose over the property. Robert had advised against this. He told me it was unusual, potentially unnecessary, and emotionally charged. He said we could win without it. Daniel had been insistent, apparently. He'd written it into his instructions, "Read the letter." So we read the letter. The hearing was on a Thursday. My parents were there with their attorney, a man I'd never met, blandly aggressive in the way that certain lawyers are. Kayla was there. My mother would not make eye contact with me when we walked in. My father looked old in a way I hadn't noticed before, and the grief of that nearly knocked me sideways. Robert read the codicil first. Straightforward, legal, clear. My parents' attorney objected on procedural grounds that everyone in the room knew were not going to hold. The judge, a woman in her late 50s who had clearly seen every variety of family dispute imaginable, listened, asked a few questions, and indicated that the codicil appeared to be in order. Then Robert said he had one additional document to enter into the record, per the explicit instructions of the deceased. He read the letter, all 6 pages, in that courtroom, in front of my parents and my sister and a judge and a handful of strangers. I watched my mother's face while he read. I watched her face when he read the part out about how they had never been able to see me clearly. I watched her face when he read the part about teaching me to disappear. I watched her face when he read the part about Kayla and the version of reality she'd been handed. and I watched her face when Robert read those last lines. The ones about me showing up, the ones about the silence on the porch, the ones about I saw you, I see you, you matter more than they let you believe. My mother put her hand over her mouth, and I think for just a moment something broke through. The judge ruled in my favor. The property transfer was invalidated. The house, legally and completely, became mine. My parents' attorney made a final procedural argument that was dismissed. It was over in less than 90 minutes from start to finish. Walking out of that courthouse, I didn't feel triumphant. I want to be honest about that. There was no fist pumping, no catharsis, no sense of vindication. I felt hollowed out and grateful and desperately sad that the only reason any of us were there was because the person who should have been at the center of all of it was not there at all. I stood in the parking lot and I cried. Robert stood nearby and said nothing, which was exactly the right thing to do. It has been almost a year and a half since that hearing. I own the house. I moved in about 3 months after the ruling. I spent a few weeks fixing small things, painting a bedroom, making it feel like a place I actually lived and not just inherited. The hardwood floors Daniel loved are still there. The back porch where we had our last real conversations is still there. I sit there sometimes in the evenings. In September, when the light does that glowing thing, I sit there and I talk to him. I tell him about my week. I tell him ridiculous small things. I tell him that his taste in kitchen fixtures was genuinely terrible, and I'm sorry, but I replaced them. I imagine him laughing at that. My relationship with my parents is complicated. There's no clean resolution there. I want to be honest with you about that, because I think too many of these stories end with a neat reconciliation that ties everything up. Life isn't that. My mother did call me about 3 weeks after the hearing. The call was short and uncomfortable, and she didn't apologize directly. She's not capable of that, not yet, maybe not ever, but she said something that I held on to. She said, "I know I didn't always see you the way I should have. I'm sorry for that. It wasn't enough, but it was something. It was more than I expected." My father came over to the house once last spring. He stood on the back porch for a long time without talking. Then he said he really loved you, Meg, and his voice cracked on the last word. "I know," I said. "I know he did. Kayla and I have not spoken since the hearing. I don't know if we ever will." I'm not the one who spread the story through our extended family, as Megan sued us for the house. I'm not the one who characterized Daniel's final wishes as the result of manipulation. And I'm not the one who needs to initiate repair in that relationship. If she ever gets to a place where she's ready to have an honest conversation, I'll be open to it. But I'm not holding my breath. What I want to say, if I'm being completely honest about why I'm sharing this with you, is this. I spent 30 plus years in a family that taught me to make myself smaller so other people could feel bigger. I spent 30 plus years believing that the quiet accommodation, the gracious acceptance, the "you'll be fine, you're the strong one," I believed that was love. I believed that was what you did for the people you loved. My brother's letter did not fix that overnight. It's not some magic cure. I still catch myself minimizing, still catch myself instinctively apologizing for existing in spaces I have every right to occupy. But I have 6 handwritten pages that say, "I see you. You matter more than they let you believe." And on the hard nights, when the old voices get loud, I read them. There's one more thing I want to tell you. After I moved into the house, I was going through a drawer in Daniel's office. He had kept it very organized in the Daniel way, and I found a small notebook. Personal notes, mostly, things he was reading, quotes he liked, random thoughts. Toward the back, there were a few pages with notes that looked like they'd been made around the time he visited Robert Calloway. On one page, in his handwriting, there was a list. It just said, things Megan doesn't know about herself, and underneath, he had written 7 things. I'm not going to share all of them, because some of them are private, in a way that feels like they're still just for me. But the first one on the list said, she thinks showing up is ordinary. It isn't. I don't know why I still cry every time I read that. Actually, I do know. I just don't have words for it yet. If you're watching this and you have someone in your life who shows up for you, who makes the drive, who manages the paperwork, who sits with you in comfortable silence, please tell them you see it. Please tell them it matters. Don't wait until you're writing letters from a hospital bed. Don't wait at all. My name is Megan Holloway. I'm 34 years old. I live in my brother's house, which is now my house, which he made sure of from the beginning, and I miss him every single day. But I know he sees me, and that, somehow, impossibly painfully, is enough. Thank you for listening. If this story touched you in some way, please leave a comment below. I read every single one. And if you know someone who needs to hear that being the strong one doesn't mean you matter less, share this with them.